is the mule.
And the
Chasing
man
something that somebody's always teasing
constantly
her
chasing a
with.
man
Yeah.
who always eludes her.
Well, they just always hold up something more than they're prepared to give.
The lights in the studio were still on that night, but the music had already stopped. Instruments sat untouched. Microphones stood in place, waiting for a voice that would not return. No one in the room said it out loud, but something had already gone wrong long before anyone realized it. Janis Joplin had been in that same room not long before, working through recordings that were supposed to define the next stage of her career. There had been arguments. Real ones. Not quiet disagreements, but moments where people stopped the session, raised their voices, and refused to move forward. Different men, different conflicts, all pulling in separate directions. In those final weeks, nothing was simple anymore. A producer demanding control. An executive pushing for decisions. Bandmates who no longer stood on the same side. And a relationship that had become unpredictable at the worst possible time. Each situation stood on its own, but together, they created a pattern that no one fully stopped. There was no single moment where everything collapsed. No one argument that ended it all. Instead, it was a series of clashes that kept building one after another until the space around her began to change. The people who once stood close were no longer in the same place. The structure that once held everything together was gone. By the time anyone stepped back and looked at the full picture, it was already too late to fix it. And that is what makes this story different. Because this is not just about what happened in the final hours. It is about the conflicts that led there, the people involved, the moments where things could have gone another way but did not. 5 men, 5 confrontations. And each one pushed the story closer to an ending no one was ready to face. Before everything began to fall apart, Janis Joplin had already built a reputation that no one in rock could ignore. She did not enter the industry quietly, and she did not rise by following rules. Her voice did not sound controlled or polished. It sounded raw, immediate, and impossible to replicate. That was exactly what made her stand out. On stage, there was no distance between her and the audience. Every performance felt direct. There was no separation, no filter. Crowds did not just listen, they reacted. And that reaction turned into momentum. By the late 1960s, she was no longer part of a growing scene. She was one of the names defining it. But success did not come with stability. The structure around her kept changing. Bands formed, then broke apart. Recording sessions moved from one direction to another. Management, producers, and musicians all had their own expectations, and those expectations did not always match. That was where the real pattern began. The conflicts were not hidden. They happened in studios, in meetings, in rehearsals. Different people, different situations, but the same result. Disagreement that did not fully resolve. The different people in 100 because it tax 5 or has. The town uniperses in 7 The tancher haven prov. The tancher haven in 7 on 100 prov. The tancher haven and when speaks of submitted. The tancher haven. Instead of one major collapse, it was a series of confrontations that slowly reshaped everything around her. A producer who wanted control over every sound. An executive who pushed for decisions that would reach a wider audience. Band members who no longer agreed on the direction forward. And a personal relationship that became unstable at the worst possible time. Each of these situations involved a specific person. A real figure. A direct confrontation. None of them ended everything on their own. But each one changed the structure around her in a way that could not be reversed. By 1970, the environment was no longer the same as it had been just a few years earlier. The people who once stood beside her were either gone, replaced, or in conflict. The support system that had carried her rise was no longer intact. And when that structure began to break apart, everything that followed became harder to control. Because in the end, it was not just about the music anymore. It was about who remained and who did not. Number 5. Paul A. Rothschild. The session did not start with an argument. It started like any other recording day in Los Angeles. Musicians in place, equipment ready, a schedule to follow. But it did not stay that way for long. Paul A. Rothschild was known for control. Inside the studio, nothing moved without his approval. Every take had a purpose. Every sound had to meet a standard. He had built his reputation on that discipline, and he was not about to change it now. The first interruption came suddenly. Midway through a take, Rothschild stopped the recording. No warning, no discussion, just a clear signal to cut everything. He wanted it done again. Not louder, not softer, different, more precise, more controlled. Something that could be shaped, repeated, and perfected. The response was immediate. The take had not been finished, and stopping it like that broke the momentum completely. There was no agreement to restart under those conditions. They tried again. This time, the direction was even clearer. Follow the structure. Stay within the timing. Keep the delivery consistent. Rothschild made it clear that this was not optional. This was how the record would be made. But the second take did not go the way he expected. The performance did not follow the structure he demanded. It pushed outside of it, and when he stopped the session again, the tension in the room was no longer subtle. Musicians stepped back. No one spoke. Then the criticism came directly. Rothschild questioned the performance itself. Not the recording quality, not the arrangement, the performance. He made it clear that what he was hearing was not strong enough for the album they were trying to build. That moment changed the direction of the entire session. The discussion that followed was no longer about fixing a take. It was about control, who had it, and who refused to give it up. The session continued, but not as a collaboration. Every take carried resistance. Every instruction met with pushback. The room was no longer working toward the same goal. Within a short time, the outcome became clear. Rothschild stepped away from the project. The producer who had been brought in to shape the record was gone. And with him went the structure that had been holding the sessions together. What remained was unfinished work, rising pressure, and a studio that no longer had a clear direction. And once that control was gone, the next conflict moved in to take its place. Number 4. Clive Davis. The conflict did not stay inside the studio. It moved into offices, meetings, and decisions that carried far more weight than a single recording session. Clive Davis was not interested in uncertainty. From his position at Columbia Records, every release had to be planned, structured, and positioned to succeed. Timing mattered, song selection mattered, image mattered. Nothing was left to chance. After the issues in the studio, the focus shifted to what would come next. The album still needed direction. A single had to be chosen. A release plan had to be finalized. And Davis expected those decisions to move forward without delay. The meeting did not take long to turn tense. Davis pushed for a clear choice. A track that could be promoted, played on radio, and reach beyond the existing audience. From his perspective, this was not a debate. It was a necessary step. The response was immediate. The decision was not accepted. The idea of selecting a song based on how it would perform commercially was rejected outright. The album was not meant to be shaped that way. Davis did not change his position. He made it clear that without a defined single, the release would not move forward as planned. Schedules could shift. Promotion could slow down. Opportunities could be lost. The discussion became direct. This was no longer about music alone. It was about control over what the public would hear and how it would be presented. Davis held the authority to decide how the record would be released, but the resistance to that control was just as firm. The meeting ended without full agreement. Decisions were delayed, plans remained unsettled, and the pressure that came with that uncertainty did not stay in the office. It followed every step that came after. Recording sessions now carried a second layer of urgency. Not just finishing the music, but doing it under a timeline that was no longer stable. Every delay mattered. Every unresolved decision added weight. And while the work continued, the conflict remained unresolved. Because when the person controlling the release and the person creating the record cannot agree, the result is not compromise. It is pressure. And that pressure does not disappear. It builds. By the time the next conflict surfaced, the situation was already shifting beyond control. Number 3. Sam Andrew. The conflict with Clive Davis was about decisions behind closed doors. The next one was not. It happened in rehearsals on stage and in front of the people who had built everything from the beginning. Sam Andrew had been there during the early rise with Big Brother and the holding company. He was not an outsider, he was part of the foundation. The sound, the performances, the identity of the band all came from that group working together. But by the time things began to change, that balance no longer held. The issue was not hidden. It showed up in rehearsals first. Set lists became a point of disagreement. How long each song would run, who led the transitions, where the focus should stay during a performance. These were not small details. They defined what the band actually was. Sam Andrew pushed for structure. A band that played together, shared the space, and maintained a consistent sound. That was how they had built their name. The response went in the opposite direction. The performances no longer followed that structure. Songs stretched longer. The delivery changed night to night. The spotlight did not stay evenly distributed. It moved, and it stayed there. The tension became clear during live shows. Andrew attempted to keep arrangements tight, signaling transitions, trying to pull the performance back into a defined shape. But those signals were not always followed. The result was visible. Moments where the band was not fully aligned, timing that did not match, direction that split in real time. After the shows, the disagreements continued. Rehearsals turned into arguments about control. Not just how the music sounded, but who decided how it would be played. There was no single moment where everything broke. It was a series of clashes that kept repeating, each one pushing the distance further. Eventually, the decision was made. The paths would separate. It was not presented as a collapse. It was framed as a step forward. But inside that decision was a clear result of the conflict. The band would continue without her. She would move forward without them. And once that split happened, the structure that had once kept everything together was gone. What came next would not have that same balance. And without that balance, the next conflict would carry even more weight. Number 2. David Getz. The separation from Sam Andrew did not happen in isolation. It came from a larger breakdown inside Big Brother and the holding company, and one of the people at the center of that final decision was David Getz. This was not about one performance or one disagreement. It came down to a direct conversation about what would happen next. The band had a direction, a sound that had already proven it could work. Touring schedules were being planned. There was a path forward that kept everything intact. But that plan did not hold. During a meeting about the future, Getz pushed to keep the group together, maintain the lineup, stay with the sound that had brought them success. From his point of view, breaking away made no sense when the band was already established. The response was clear and immediate. That direction was not going to continue. There was no attempt to soften it, no gradual shift. The decision to move forward separately had already been made. The discussion turned direct. Getz argued for stability, a working system that did not need to be replaced. He made it clear that leaving the band would change everything, not just for one person, but for everyone involved. But the position on the other side did not change. The next step would not include the band. At that point, there was nothing left to negotiate. The meeting ended without agreement, but with a final outcome. The separation would move forward. Schedules would change. Performances would no longer be shared. From the outside, it looked like a standard move in the music industry. Artists leaving bands to go solo. It had happened before. But inside the room, it was a direct conflict that ended in a complete break. And with that break, something important disappeared. The band had not just been a group of musicians. It had been a structure, a system where responsibilities were shared, where decisions were not carried by one person alone. Once that system was gone, everything shifted. The next phase would not have that support. Every decision, every performance, every conflict would now land in one place. And with that weight concentrated, the final conflict would hit closer than any of the others. Number 1. Seth Morgan. By the time everything else had already started to fall apart, the final conflict came from the one place that had no structure at all. Seth Morgan was not part of the studio, not part of the label, and not part of any band. That was exactly what made the situation different. There were no schedules, no contracts, no clear boundaries. What happened between them was direct, personal, and unpredictable. In the final weeks, their contact became inconsistent. Plans were made, then changed. Meetings were expected, then did not happen. Communication broke down at the worst possible time. There was a specific moment that stood out. A planned meeting did not take place. No clear explanation, no immediate follow-up. Just a gap where something was supposed to happen but did not. That gap turned into distance. Attempts to reconnect did not bring resolution. Instead, they led to more disagreement. The conversations that did happen were short and unresolved. No clear outcome, no agreement on what would happen next. Unlike the earlier conflicts, this one had no external pressure to force a solution. No producer stepping in, no executive setting a deadline, no band trying to hold things together. It remained unresolved. And that made it more unstable than anything that came before. In the days leading up to the final recording sessions, the situation did not improve. The distance remained. The communication stayed broken. There was no return to what had been planned. When everything else was already under pressure, this became the closest conflict. The one that followed into private spaces, into the hours when there was no studio, no meeting, no performance to focus on. And in those final hours, there was no resolution. No final conversation that changed anything. No agreement that brought things back together. Just the absence of what had been there before. Because when every other structure is already gone, the last thing holding everything together matters more than anything else. And when that disappears as well, there is nothing left to absorb what comes next. When the story finally reached its last chapter, there was no single event that explained everything. No one moment that could carry the full weight of what had happened. Instead, it was the result of a chain of conflicts that never fully resolved. Janis Joplin had moved through each of them one by one. A producer who walked away after losing control in the studio. An executive who could not secure agreement on how the music should be released. Bandmates who separated after direct confrontations about the future. And a personal relationship that broke down at the worst possible time. Each situation ended without a clean resolution. Not fixed, not repaired, just left behind as the next one began. From the outside, the timeline still looked like progress. Recording sessions continued. Plans were still being discussed. The album moved forward even without a clear structure holding it together. But underneath that movement, the pattern had already formed. Every conflict removed something. Every disagreement took away a layer of stability. Every unresolved moment made the next one harder to manage. By the time everything came together, it was not in a way anyone had expected. The structure that once supported her career was no longer there. The people who had once stood closest were either gone or no longer aligned. And when the news finally broke in October 1970, it did not just mark an ending. It forced people to look back at everything that had led there. Not just the music, not just the success, but the series of confrontations that had quietly reshaped the final chapter. Because in the end, it was not one decision that defined the outcome. It was 5,